Happy May Day, everybody. Welcome to Chat from the Old Cap. It's a beautiful day here in Iowa City, and we hope it's a beautiful day wherever you are joining us from. My name is Tony Hakes. I'm the Director of Regional Programs here. We're going to start our program in just a minute as we wait for a few more people to arrive. But as always, it's perfect that we're having this particular episode on May Day today. May is a new beginning and spring and trying new things. And the work that this group that you're going to hear from today and what they've done to help people with those new beginnings is going to be really very, very relevant and very exciting to hear from them. It's also Herkies on Parade. So if you're familiar with that program, all the Herkies are being unveiled all over the state today. If you get a chance, go check them out. Again, fills in very well with another beautiful spring day here in Iowa. So a couple quick housekeeping things before we get started. If you would like to ask a question, we'll have some time for that towards the end, but you can ask that question at any time using the Q&A function. We'll also be putting a bunch of items in our chat today, so keep an eye on that, ways that you can give to the program, ways that you can find out more information about this incredible research and this incredible group and how they've been able to help and save so many lives. We are very honored to have Peg Nopoulos as our moderator today. Peg is a professor of psychiatry, pediatrics, neurology, and the chair of the department and executive officer of psychiatry at the University of Iowa. That is a mouthful, Peg. That's congratulations to you and all your success. Her research focuses on an exciting new world of psychedelics and the potential treatment options for patients with those powerful medications. New studies in this area combine the use of psilocybin in combination with research, MIR brain scans to better understand how these types of medications may be helpful in treatment of mental disorders. Peg, it is an absolute honor to have you as our host today, and I'll turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony. Well, really excited to host today. This is a special, like you said, it's a new beginning, May 1. And this is really exciting for all of us. So just a brief introduction to the structure of what we're going to do is that we have a panel here. So we have experts, and we also have a special guest who's going to talk about his personal experience with psychedelics. And the structure is I'm going to be asking questions. So I'll be directing questions to the panelists. Also, I'll speak about myself a little bit and what we're doing. And then Tony already mentioned it, but really important that towards the end of the hour, probably at the 50-minute mark, we'd like to open it up to a question and answer session. That's going to be really important for us to be able to answer those questions. So that's the structure. And in a minute, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves. But I'd also like at the top to mention the role of philanthropy, because philanthropy has been vital in helping us getting our protocols and psychedelics off the ground. So we're really honored to have the support of Patrick and Mary Scanlon, as well as Pete Scobell and Terry Penningroth. And their investments in our work has really helped to launch the research that you'll hear more about today, and hopefully will continue into the future. And just to emphasize that philanthropic support really helps us to move research faster and further. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and have our panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll start out with the questions for the panelists from me. So the first person to introduce herself is going to be Dr. Candida Maurer.
Hello, I'm so glad people are tuning in. We are thrilled to be doing this research in Iowa. I am a psychologist. I've been doing this work for 45 years, and I can truly say that psychedelics changed my life. In my 20s, I was lost, and I had the opportunity to try LSD, and it literally changed my life. I realized during my experience that I was supposed to be a psychologist, and I was supposed to help people. And I didn't know that, but then I did know it. And I went to grad school, and I got married, and I had children, and I completely stopped any psychedelic work whatsoever. But I did a lot of psychological work with people. And then my husband died, and that opened me up to recreating myself. And I started reading about psychedelic research, and I was so excited by it because it's so positive and so hopeful. And in my opinion, it's the best thing that's come along in psychiatry in my entire career. So I'm very happy to be here, and I want to share information with you.
Perfect. Dr. Michael Flaum.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Michael Flaum. I'm a psychiatrist. I've spent almost my entire career at the University of Iowa. Came as a postdoctoral fellow back in the 80s and have really had a blessed opportunity to do a wide variety of things. I've worked with PEG for a long time now, and I transitioned to emeritus status about 6 years ago. And people say, how's retirement? And I always say, I didn't retire. I just transitioned to a status where all I want to do at this stage of my life are things that I feel are really important. And one of those things, something that I turned my attention to shortly after making this transition, frankly, wasn't even sure it was a safe thing to do. Because 6 years ago, we didn't talk about psychedelics with the freedom that we do today. But I kind of very timidly went to PEG and said, well, now that I'm emeritus, I'm going to pursue some things that you may not, I don't know what you're going to think about this, but I'm going to this conference on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And instead of saying, what? She just said, that is great. That's exactly what I think we should be doing. That is very much a part of what I see as the future of this field. And to say she has been supportive of this is a gross understatement. She's in fact taken the lead, and I've been privileged to be a part of it.
Yeah.
And our special guest, Aaron Martin.
Thanks, Dr. Nopoulos. I am Aaron Martin. I'm age 51 from St. Louis, Missouri. And it's not lost on me, as we go through this, I think it's important to kind of point out that being a white male born in the United States, I have a life of privilege. And, as you hear the panel today, it's also important, I think, for everyone to realize and for you to know that throughout my life, I perpetuated kind of the stigmas, and lies around psychedelic medicine. I've spent my entire life, I guess, feeling the need to prove I am good enough. Fortunately, 12 years ago, the introduction, to psychedelic medicine saved my life and helped me recover from some very severe depression. So what happened, is I spent my life unconsciously kind of manufacturing a persona, if you will, a formula for connecting with others and really avoiding feelings because I didn't trust my feelings, and I thought they were bad, made me feel weak, and quite frankly, out of control. And instead of being a human being, right, and being, I more or less arrogantly, I created this artificial intelligence or a robot simply going through the motions. So from the outside perspective, I had this dream life, and but little did I know that program it was unsustainable, and I was coping, throughout the course of my life and surviving, I should say. I thought I was thriving, but it wasn't that at all. It was simply surviving because I was addicted to work. I was addicted to nicotine, to alcohol, anything that could take me away from, having me to sit with myself. So it just all numbed me out. And I was hiding of who I was, repressing my feelings, acting like a robot, which made it really impossible to connect, with the ones that I love most. So after my most recent session, I guess it was about 2 years ago, it became my mission to become a voice. So today, I owe it to you to really tell the truth about, my experience with psychedelics. Not easy to talk about, I'm not gonna lie. But what I do know is that the psychedelic medicine really helped me address, the problems that I was going through. And I want to kind of now readdress, I should say, those stigmas and lies that I helped promote years ago, because were it not for this technology, I'm simply another statistic. So looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aaron. So what we're going to do is delve into some more specifics. We'll also come back to Aaron and hear a little bit more in detail about his experience and how it helped him. But we're going to start with some of the basics, really important to lay the groundwork for understanding, how we think about these medicines. So the first question is to Dr. Maurer. Psychedelic drugs have an interesting history, right? In our country and others. Can you provide a brief background on the history of psychedelic medicine?
Sure, I would like to. And I'm hoping the history might even help relieve some of the stigma around psychedelics. We know that as human beings, we have been using psychedelics literally for 7,000 years or more. So something's going on that's right with these medicines. And we, of course, we're not using them in the United States, but we are now. And what happened here was the Native Americans were using them, but we don't know a whole lot about what they were doing. But in the 1950s and 1960s, LSD, which is a psychedelic, was legal. And it was used by psychiatrists for up to 40,000 people received LSD from their psychiatrist for alcoholism, for depression, and for other disorders. And it was remarkable. People were talking about rapid and sustained positive behavior change. They were saying, this is not like any other medicine we've ever used. And that is still true. Unfortunately, the Vietnam War comes along, it's heating up, and President Nixon is looking for a way to shut down the anti-war activists. And he and his advisors came up with the idea that if they made psychedelics illegal, that would shut it down. And it did. We had the war on drugs and all research stopped and people got scared. And I got scared. We all kind of took that in as part of our culture for a while. In the year 2000, the Johns Hopkins Hospital, which is a world famous hospital, they started research. And they did that with FDA approval, and they used psilocybin, which is otherwise known as magic mushrooms. And we are using psilocybin in our research. And the first thing they did was look at the safety of psilocybin, and they found it to be extraordinarily safe, which did not compute with what we thought was going on, but it's the truth. Psilocybin is a very safe medication. Not only that, they found that it was really effective for severe depression. And they've been using it for alcoholism, for other addictive disorders, and they've been using it for end-of-life issues. What the research is finding at this point, and it's going on all over the world, is that up to 70% of people, and sometimes even more than 70%, are, I'm going to even use the word healed, by psychedelic medicine. It's not always a one-shot deal, so I don't want to give that impression, but 70% is a huge number of people receiving positive outcome, and it's so much bigger than any other medication we have. So it's thrilling that we have it in Iowa, and I'm thrilled to be a part of the research.
Awesome, thank you. Next question is to Dr. Pflaum. So there are several different drugs in the category, classic psychedelics, and others that might be classified as psychedelic-like. I'm wondering if you can summarize that and then also briefly talk about their effects. And so one thing I think I'll do, just to let everyone know, that there's going to be some slides. So I'm actually going to pull up some slides now because Michael is going to walk through some of this.
Yeah, I've been an academic so long that I think in PowerPoint, so you have to forgive me.
And you guys can see that?
As Dr. Nopoulos mentioned, this term psychedelic, I'm sure you've all been reading about it in the lay press. There's so much about it these days. But people actually mean a variety of different things when they use the term. And they're talking about different substances, some of which are organic and found in nature, and some of which are synthesized in the laboratory. But what we're really going to be focusing on today are the so-called classic or classical psychedelics. And that's what you see in red. And the term psychedelic was actually coined for that group. We sometimes used to call these hallucinogens or psychotogenic medicines different names. They said, we need something in the 50s, as Dr. Maurer mentioned, when this started coming to use. So we've got to have a term that captures, what these specific medicines seem to do. And they came up with this term psyche, which is human mind or soul, and delic, to manifest, to make clear, to make visible, to reveal. And these are the drugs like psilocybin that we're focusing on, but like LSD, which was synthesized in the lab, like ayahuasca, which has been used sacramentally especially in South America, for millennia, as Dr. Maurer mentioned, mescaline, which was the psychedelic used by Native Americans primarily, I believe. And there are lots of things we can talk about some of these other medicines. And as a matter of fact, MDMA is the one that is probably going to be FDA approved. The FDA is going to make a decision about that one as soon as August of this year. But for our purposes today, we're going to focus on those classics. So next slide, please, Peg. So briefly, one of the things that defines these classics is actually their chemical effects and their chemical structure. And you don't have to be an organic chemist to understand that the top there, psilocybin and its active metabolite psilocin, you can actually see how similar that is to one of the neurotransmitters that are really important as we think about psychiatric disorders. Some of the most commonly used antidepressants affect serotonin receptors. There are lots of different serotonin receptors in the brain, and what's interesting is that each of the medicines in this classic psychedelic category have a very strong effect on one specific type of receptor. And what I'm showing in that oval area is the red shows where those receptors are. And what we know is that they're the receptors that are very, very common and highly expressed in the higher brain portion, the cerebral cortex, especially in the frontal cortex, which is sort of what differentiates humans from lower primates. I'm not saying that we fully understand what the connection is, but these drugs are chemically related and chemically distinct from the other drugs that you saw in that previous slide that were not the classics. And if you go to the next slide, Peg, that chemical distinction seems to result in a clinical phenomena that is different from the other medicines. And it's actually hard to describe. People use the term ineffable, like hard to talk about. But it often comes down to this sudden and very powerful sense of seeing oneself differently, especially in relation to other people and things. It's this sense of interconnectedness, oneness, a unitive experience. And sometimes even people talk about ego dissolution or ego death. It is a powerful experience. And it often results, as Aaron was kind of alluding to, with these sudden, beyond insights, really epiphanies, what gets sometimes called a quantum change. This is a book by a mentor of mine who wasn't talking about psychedelics at all, but he was talking about sometimes when people have these sudden dramatic changes. Next slide, Peg. And in fiction, we know these changes, right? The classic stories of Ebenezer Scrooge, the Jimmy Stewart character in It's a Wonderful Life, which we've all seen. Something happened to those fictional characters that changed their view of, or reminded them perhaps, of who they really were, what was important, what their core values were, and allowed them to look at the discrepancy between those core values and their behavior. And because of that, at least in fiction, had a long stand or had a dramatic change in the way they felt about their lives. What we know, and what Aaron will testify to, I imagine, what the research shows, is that that's what happens to lots and lots of people, not everybody, but the majority of people who take these classic psychedelics will report that it's one of the most important experiences of their life. And studies have shown that if you look out more than a year, that initial change seems to be sustained, which is really quite something. Very different than sort of the way we use other medicines in psychiatry, which is on a regular basis. I hope that sort of addresses the question you had, Dr. Nopoulos, and I think I'm done with my portion of the slides.
Yeah, that does. I'm going to keep this up here because I'm going to go next to candidates, but I'll also qualify that too. So all of that is absolutely true, really important, Michael. But I think that the really key qualifier on there is for anybody who has done these, they'll say, wait a minute, that wasn't my experience. What's really important is what we're going to talk about today is psychedelics in the hands of professionals in a method which allows for that quantum change, right? Because psychedelics are used socially, right? But we are really talking about a methodology that's really standardized that allows for a quantum change, in particular for a patient who is interested in changing and helping with a mental state. And so that brings me to the next question, is actually to Dr. Maurer. So explaining, what exactly is the process for treatment with psychedelic medicine. And I'm going to pull this up because this is an image. And so you can walk us through that, Dr. Maurer.
Yeah, this is a picture of Johns Hopkins University. The woman here is Mary Casamano. She's credited with guiding the most trips in the world. She's somewhere between 1,900 and 2,000 trips at this point. And you can see that the person experiencing the magic mushrooms, the psilocybin, is wearing an eye mask, and you might not see, but she's also wearing headphones. And both of those are important. The music is actually, it is put together in order to enhance the psychedelic experience. And it does do, in fact, that. It will take people into particular emotions, moods, thoughts, etc. And the other part of this treatment is this is the medicine session, and it is 6 hours or longer, which is a long time. On the other hand, it's the best time I've ever spent in therapy. So I don't dislike my 6-hour times with people. But there are 3 parts to treatment. There's preparation. There is the medicine day, which we call a trip, by the way. And we call it a trip because actually you go somewhere else. You go somewhere you've never been before. And it's important to be okay with that idea that you're going somewhere unique and unusual. And the preparation is definitely telling people this is what's going to happen to you. It's also about really learning about them. We do a long history about how they got to where they are now, what their childhood was like, what their behaviors are like currently, what their relationships are like currently, and what they want to change. So it's really important to help them hone their ideas of what their intention is for their experience with the medicine. Because intention often does guide the psychedelic journey. And we want to be very careful to hone intentions that are realistic. And at the same time, the medicine does what the medicine does. I mean, it takes you where it's going to take you. And my experience is it always takes you to a place that you need to go. Always. I'm saying that very insistently. After the trip is the third part of the treatment, and that is called integration. And that begins as the trip is winding down. It goes on the next day, and it goes on a week after that. And that's when we are reminding the person what we observed during their journey experience. What exactly were they experiencing? Like, we will be writing down every word they said. We'll be watching their bodies. We'll be looking for tension. We'll be looking for movement. And we're going to ask them what was going on at that point. And they will remember it. They don't go into a blank space. They remember very clearly what happened to them. And we want them to do that. And what we are looking for are the insights and the new perspectives that they gained during their journey. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take those insights and those new perspectives, and we are going to talk about, well, how on earth are you going to change your behavior so that this insight, this perspective can become your new reality? And that's the part where integration really takes place. And really, integration goes on forever. I mean, really, we're all trying to integrate whatever we're trying to integrate. But there is a time period after a trip that is a very open time for people to learn and enact new behaviors.
So good. And I'll just also qualify that from essentially the three parts, right? So the preparation, the medicine, and then the integration, that's not a long period of time, right?
Correct. It's like, preparation starts a week or two before the trip. There are 2 preparation sessions. They are both 2 hours long. Then there's the actual 6-hour experience or longer. We stay with them until it's done.
Right.
They're never left alone.
Yeah.
And then integration is another 4 hours, 2 hours the day after and 2 hours a week after. And really and truly, ultimately, I would love for us to be able to do integration longer, but in research, we're limited by our resources, honestly. Right. Yeah.
So and that's a good transition to what I'm going to talk about. But it's important to talk about that the protocol is really a week or two. Preparation, medicine, integration. It really is, and that's the other part that's so powerful is that it's not weeks and weeks and months. It's really packed into a pretty short period of time. So I wanted to go back a little bit and talk about the University of Iowa and what we're doing in psychedelic medicine. And back to the comment that Michael said is that when, he came to me and said, "Hey, Peg, I might be doing some pretty edgy stuff." And I said, "That's awesome." Because it's really important to know that and by the way, just for background on me, I have done all my training at the University of Iowa. So I am now leading a department that grew me. And I think it's really important as our identity. We have some of these phrases and I take them seriously: changing medicine, changing lives. As an academic medical center, who we should be, the fabric of who we are should be cutting edge. Yep. We should be on the edge. And we should be able to provide cutting edge treatments that you can get nowhere else. And so it's one of the reasons why I was so excited that Michael wanted to learn more about psychedelic medicine and then have him bring in Dr. Maurer so that we could really get moving on it. And this was now a couple of years ago. But what's really important, and I'll mention it again, based on the philanthropic funds that we've been given that we're so grateful for, we've been able to stand up a research protocol. Now, what's really important is remember, psilocybin is a drug that is not FDA approved. How do you get a drug FDA approved? How can we make this available to everybody? Mm-hmm. You have to do it through science. Yep. You have to do it through what's called randomized controlled clinical trials, where in a very specific research setting, you compare somebody who got psilocybin versus somebody who maybe got a placebo or maybe got another drug. And in a very organized fashion, you find out, is psilocybin better than placebo? Is it better than that other drug? And only after multiple and valid and rigorous randomized clinical trials will the FDA even consider this. And so that's the phase that we're in. We're starting these research protocols. We're not the first, but we're among the first. And I can tell you that in the Midwest, we're the first to do these. And so I am going to share my screen again, just so that we can get a little bit of detail on. So are you guys seeing the presentation there? So this is our current protocol. So it is psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, what we call PAP, and we're comparing it to ketamine. So it's an active comparator. And remember, ketamine, if you remember back to that slide that Dr. Flaum showed, it is a psychedelic-like. It's not a classic psychedelic, but it is an active comparator. So we're comparing these two drugs. And we're looking at it in men who have alcohol use disorder. So there are some specifics about the inclusion criterion here that it's up. I don't think we need to go over the details of that. But this is a protocol that's currently running. And we're really excited about it. I think that this allows us to show the world that we're able to get the regulatory approval for moving things forward. And we expect this to be just the beginning. The other thing that's really important is that we're adding science into this protocol. So not only are we going to ask the question, is psilocybin better than ketamine? And does this work for alcohol use disorder? But how does it work? And so a lot of my research in the past has been looking at brain imaging. So a tool that allows us to evaluate the human brain. And what we do is we take an image before the psychedelic administration and ketamine, and then afterwards. And we're not the first ones to do this. I'm actually going to show you a picture. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words in the context of how psychedelics might be working in the brain. So what you'll see here two circles, right? One of them says placebo, the other one says psilocybin. And I want you to notice on the outside of the circle are these other colored circles, right? And then you see these lines that connect. And essentially, that just shows the connectivity of the brain. So the brain works in circuits, right? It works with pieces of the brain that are constantly talking to each other. And we call that functional connectivity. So that's what this image is showing. So the threads that you see going across the circle are connecting the brain into certain circuits. Then you can see on psilocybin what happens. And that is that there is a really dramatic change in the connectivity of the brain. There are new connections, there are new pathways. And most importantly, there may be old pathways, right, that get dissolved. So old pathways that may be stuck in a rut, right? I need a drink, I'm sad, that get dissolved and a new pathway put in its place. So that's a very generalized viewpoint of essentially what we're thinking about, not only in the context of a clinical trial, but also trying to understand the neurobiology behind that. I have one more question for Dr. Flaum, and so that is, you touched upon this, actually Canada mentioned it in the history, but I wanted you to talk a little bit more specifically about the safety of these drugs, and in particular, psilocybin, the safety of psilocybin.
Yeah. One of the tragedies, I think, if you go to the next slide, Peg, I'll show you. One of the things that was unfortunate about about basically taking these drugs off the market and calling them, quote, Schedule 1 drugs, which basically says they have no clinical utility and they're extremely dangerous. And the danger could be they're very easy to get dependent upon, or they are lethal in overdose, or easy to kill yourself on. And in fact, the classic psychedelics are the opposite of what we think of as the most dangerous drugs. So heroin is your exemplar of something that is very easily to get dependent upon. And the toxic dose is actually very, very close to the effective clinical dose. And that's why we have so many overdose deaths, especially on people, who haven't used it for a while, and they may be more sensitive to it, and they think they're taking a dose that's going to get them where they want to go, and it's a toxic dose. It is really, really, really hard to kill yourself on these drugs, classic psychedelics. They have an extremely safe ratio between the toxic dose and the clinically effective dose. So from a pure safety perspective, they're quite safe. And actually, in terms of dependence, they don't tend to cause people to want to take them over and over again.
Right.
And I think in the sort of abstinence recovery community, there's a lot of rethinking going on, because there are a lot of people in, say, AA who have benefited tremendously from abstinence. And the question is, oh, well, aren't these the kinds of drugs I want to avoid? And there's a lot of rethinking about that going on right now. They don't tend to result in dependence.
Great. Thank you. So I think one more question to Dr. Meyer before we go to Aaron, and that is, so building on this notion of safety, right? There's also this concept of, in the context of having a trip, that it could be a bad trip, that it could be a bad experience. And I was just wondering, Dr. Meyer, if you could discuss the potential issues and what that means, what it means to have a bad trip, and is that a problem?
It can be difficult. I'm not going to lie. And people ask me all the time, what about bad trips? And one of the things that we were taught in my certification program is, let's call them challenging trips rather than bad trips, because that is an important idea to switch to. I have certainly witnessed challenging trips, and people get anxious. They get very scared. They're facing something they have literally never faced before. They're seeing some part of themselves, really, that has come up, and maybe it is showing its face in a particular way, but however the face is being shown, it can be a scary face. It can come up as a monster. It can come up as weird visuals, weird auditory kinds of phenomena. But here's the thing. If the person is guided, so here we're back to safety, the guiding is so important. With guidance, we can take that anxiety and we can calm it down, and we can help the person move through the fear. So you don't run away from the fear. If you're afraid during a trip, the best medicine is to go straight into it as well as you can. And your guide is hopefully helping you be calm and be centered and be able to face this fear in a courageous manner. And it's very possible with that kind of guidance for that to happen. I remember one of the movies that we saw in my training was of a woman who'd had what she considered to be a bad trip. And she had cancer and she was dying. And her trip consisted of extremely heavy, dark clouds lying on top of her and not allowing her to move. And it was very unpleasant. It lasted the entire time she was using the psilocybin. And she comes out of it, and the next day she says, that was the most healing experience I ever had. Now, that is an amazing statement after that kind of a challenge, right? So even difficult trips, in fact, maybe even especially difficult trips, can be very healing in the long run. But I am going to say,
Yes.
It's really important never to do these drugs on your own. You
Right.
really need a sober person with you. You need somebody to guide you. You need somebody to keep you safe.
Yes. Just underscore, I mentioned that before, is that, a lot of people have the thought that this is, something that they can do, but no, this is really in the hands of professionals. So a great segue to, speaking of healing and courage, And that's Aaron Martin. So our special guest here today, who's really going to tell us about his healing and being courageous about coming and detailing that for us. So Aaron, you did a little bit at the top, talking about kind of briefly kind of where you were at and what it did for you. But I think, you know, definitely everyone is going to want to hear a little bit more detail about what that was like for you, how it worked, you know, what your experience was.
Sure. As you know, as I mentioned in the introduction, I spent years kind of manufacturing this artificial version of myself and, you know, running this program that was unsustainable and ultimately led me into the deep depression that I spoke of. But, you know, through the years of going through this, I, with the help of my wife, I had exhausted numerous, you know, types of traditional therapy. And quite honestly, I became beyond frustrated because I wasn't feeling better. It wasn't necessarily that it was bad therapy or anything like that. I just wasn't feeling better. And what happened was that, you know, I had created this internal warfare between my ears of what I should be feeling, right, versus what I was actually feeling. I consider myself, and that's how the program was built, right? This artificial intelligence was me being able to always outthink, outdo, outwork. But because of that awareness, what I was actually feeling versus what I thought I should be feeling, it didn't match up. And I couldn't understand why. And this battle for me really, quite honestly, made me feel as if I was going crazy. And fortunately, about, you know, 12 years ago, my wife, Diana, who quite honestly, you know, we've been together 34 years if you include dating, but she's been exposed to really the brunt, right, of my depression. And quite frankly, you know, I would even throw it into the category of emotional abuse, but was looking at the research, right, on psychedelic medicine. And she realized that, you know what, this might actually be the key for me. But that wasn't the end of it, because as you remember in what I said at the beginning, I had all these stigmas and things against not having control, right? Because that's how my program ran. So after about 10 or 11 months of me deliberating, I guess, and working through, you know, some of my fears and stigmas around the medicine, and at a great cost, you know, kind of financially and physically, I kind of reduced it down that my best legal option, you know, was to more or less leave the country and travel to Costa Rica for 7 days to receive the medicine. And I did this with a group of roughly 50 people. It was a total of 1 session per day for 4 consecutive days. Using the medicine, you know, in a group setting, it did help. I had some breakthroughs, you know, not going to lie, for sure. But really, the most important thing at that point in time is it bought me valuable time. And, you know, when I came back, I kind of did some integration, really continued with talk therapy and some of the more traditional therapy. But I really knew that I kind of had more work to do. So time elapsed, I think, I don't know, 18, 24 months or something like that. But I started looking around the US and really with Diana's help, you know, we found a competent underground therapist who really not only administered the psilocybin, but kind of like Dr. Maurer spoke about, it was quite honestly the pre-trip preparation, if you will, as well as the post-integration therapy that really helped me get over being depressed. And, you know, thankfully, one of the biggest takeaways that I'm really still working on is just the ability to distinguish the massive difference between me proving myself, right, versus building trust with myself. Because building trust with myself and others, it's been a game changer. You know, I no longer need to stay stuck in the trauma of my past and continue to kind of latch on, you know, to those stories that I would just ruminate on for just eternity. And the thing that even today that I find interesting is it's such a grounded reflex that I still have to really consciously work, because I've done that. You know, like I said, I'm 51 years old, and I've built my life on that, and it has been unbelievably liberating, you know, and freeing of these demons kind of that I speak of. Because for me, it was, you know, really just so hard to rationalize all of the irrational thoughts, and it was scary, you know. And the medicine, along with the integration therapy, gave me kind of the liberation really for the first time in my life. So, you know, I guess to sum it up, quite frankly, I mean, my experience with psychedelic medicine allowed me to find just, if nothing else, a direct path to hope. And, this is why I'm here today. The University of Iowa Hospital started this program. It's built on the exact same idea that saved my life. The research creates a direct path, to the help that many of us need. And it provides the same, hope and liberation that fortunately I experienced, and it's saving lives. Time is not a luxury when it comes to, addiction and depression, and I'm thankful to be here. So
Awesome, Aaron. If you don't mind, I'm going to follow up a little bit on that, because that was, like I said, we're so appreciative of your story, and I'm going to sum it up a little bit, and it's most importantly, you tell me if I'm off base, but it sounds like a little bit what we were talking about before, that you did have some experiences where it was in a different setting, right? It was in a group setting, and it wasn't quite the same as the protocol that we're talking about. And you got some relief from that, but you were still, and what I would call it, Aaron, is that you were sick, right?
Yeah.
You were sick with sadness, right? You had a really significant depression, and you had addiction, right? So, and you were really sick. So you got some relief, but then it was only when you had kind of the intensive one-on-one, kind of in the same protocol that we've been discussing. And then was it pretty immediate? Was your relief pretty immediate, or did it take some time? Or
I would gauge it, for me, there was immediate, but then as Dr. Maurer indicated, earlier, you experience all these different, for me, I some of my experiences where I calculated to, or would compare it to having 6 screens on the wall at the same time. You're watching 6 different football games, and I'm the offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator for all 12 teams. And that download that's coming at you. So it's fantastic because you're getting all of this, but what happens is, right, we have to still be able to function in the physical experience. So what I noticed is the further that I got away from that, some of my reflexes started kind of coming back into play. And so that group experience that I did at the beginning, it waned heavily. And so, I don't know if that answers your question, but I had immediate, but it did take, I did have to come back, and that's why I knew my work wasn't done. Yeah.
And then when you went through it the second time, that was it pretty immediate at that point?
So the difference between the one-on-one is I would not go back and do it the same way that I did it, but going back 12 years ago, it was much different. There's so much more knowledge and I think awareness, but going with the one-on-one, yes, it was night and day difference. The other thing is those 4 consecutive nights that I did it, I got to some places that I'm thankful that I got out of because I didn't, I had people there, but it wasn't a one-on-one focus. And so whereas when you have a designated sitter with you that is trained in this and certified and understands, it's an immense amount of trust that you have with not only in the person, but in the setting and everything else. There's just so many factors that go into it.
Yeah. Awesome. So I think I'm going to just finish with a little bit of future directions, and then we can open it up to questions. So, I mentioned to you that we have, started our first protocol, and like I said, thanks to the Penningroth family, we've been able to start that protocol, and then thanks to a very generous gift from the Scanlons, we'll be extending that and going broader, and including, importantly, the population of veterans. And so we're ramping up on that now. And like I said, just getting to the point where we're able to get all the regulatory stuff, and we have started enrolling and doing this treatment. So we're really excited about that. But really, that's just the beginning. Yeah. And what our vision is that we want to create a psychedelic institute. So what is a psychedelic institute, right? So instead of just one protocol, what we would love to do is to expand that to many protocols, right? So the first step would be one of our protocols, or the protocol is still limited to males. Of course, we would want to include females. But how about expanding to other addictions in terms of other substances, right? So opioids, methamphetamine. So there's absolutely, because addiction is, I think, such an important niche for these powerful drugs. But then other psychiatric diagnoses, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, eating disorders. I think there's so much more. It's really important to know it's not for everything. This may be a very, very powerful drug, but it is not for everything. It is not for the treatment of schizophrenia. It is not for the treatment of any disorder that is prone to psychosis, right? So bipolar would be in that. So it's not like, we have a hammer and everything's a nail. We know how powerful these are. And there is, a relatively wide variety of disorders that we think we can help, but it's not a panacea for everything. The other thing that an institute allows us to do is training, right? So we need to be prepared for when these drugs are FDA approved. And that means that we need professionals, we need the psychotherapists, we need people who are going to be able to stand up these kind of treatment that are assisted by the therapists. And that really means, like I said, mainstream delivery. And in the context of philanthropic gifts, so that there has been other places. So Johns Hopkins was the first one. So their philanthropic gift for the Institute was $17 million. And they created that. I think it was in 2017 when they did that. So those are the things that we're really interested in moving towards, and hopefully doing it in a relatively rapid pace so that we can be prepared. I think I'll go ahead and go to the question and answer session now. And actually, I'm going to read some of these, and then I think I'll farm them out to the experts here. So one of the first questions is the trip considered a one-time treatment, and then integration is continued treatment, or are there cases anticipated to need multiple trips? Great question, Dr. Maurer.
It's a great question. For some people, it's one trip. It really is. And it's a miracle, and I love it. And for some people, it's 2 trips or it's 3 trips. But I mean, here's the thing with, like, for instance, severe depression. Like, people get better, and maybe a year later, they're starting to get depressed again. They might need another experience. Okay, that's once a year. That's just once a year, instead of taking some kind of daily medication that has all kinds of side effects and leaves them feeling kind of rotten inside, or muted inside. So yeah, there are people who can get by with one trip, and there are people who are going to need more. And we don't, here's the thing, research, we don't know yet, right?
That's right.
We don't know.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, we don't know yet. We have some clues. We have some clues, and Michael mentioned this, and you just mentioned it too, that these do seem to be sustained, right? It's a quantum change.
Yep.
And they are sustained. And for how long they're sustained is the open question. But it does seem like it's not something you're going to need every week. It's something you may need after several months.
Yep.
Dr. Flaum, how effective are psychedelics for severe depression without alcohol use disorder?
Yeah, actually, if you look at the studies that are going on now for psilocybin, in which more than 100 trials are going on worldwide, the majority of those trials are for depression,
right.
Often treatment-resistant depression. And we are seeing the results. And so we know that it's better than placebo. A recent large multi-center study compared it directly to one of the most commonly used antidepressant medicine, showed it to be superior, but just didn't meet statistical significance over the term that it saw. Small study. I think I would just say that the signal is very much, there was a recent meta-analysis that pooled all the studies of depression so far and did show something like 70% improvement, as Dr. Maurer mentioned earlier. Still 30% not. And I will add, I'm the naysayer of the group. These guys don't like it. But 10% of the people actually got worse.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm adding that, and the reason that I'm a naysayer sometimes, is we see that a lot in clinical research, and part of it is just a disappointment. And so I just want to put out there that while 70% is a remarkable number in our business, a remarkable number, especially when we're talking about treatment-resistant depression, we have to recognize that there are some people who may not get better, and we don't want those people to be coming in with all of this hope, and that's what lead, I think, to people getting worse. So a lot we still need to work on, but big signals.
Yep. So another question, can you elaborate a bit more on the use for individuals with TBI? So I think I'll field that. So first of all, that's really, really important in the context of our veteran population, right? So very, very important. And we're just starting to learn more about it, right? You don't even actually have to have an actual head trauma to have that trauma to your brain, right? It could be percussive sounds over and over again. And those can be really problematic. And there's not a lot known about the neurobiology of what happens with traumatic brain injury. What we can say is that there is a small study that was done by our colleague in California on veterans who got ayahuasca treatment, and they did have traumatic brain injury. But I also would just like to hearken, I know this seems simplistic, right? But at the 30,000-foot view, if we're thinking about what we know these drugs are doing is changing connectivity. If you have a traumatic brain injury, you are already rewiring your brain, right? Something is happening where you have an injury in your brain, and so your brain is dealing with that, and it's probably trying to make connections that it used to make before, and it's not doing that well. And if there's a way that we could use a drug to kind of what we sometimes call flatten out the brain so that allows new connections to be made, right? That may be beneficial. So that may be the mechanism that helps with TBI. Once again, an open question. It's something for us, in particular for the veteran community, that we think is going to be very powerful. An open question for research. Here's a comment. I don't have any specific questions or comments, but first of all, some preconceived notions that we were able to dispel, which is great. And a shout out to you, Erin, for your bravery, sharing your story. And I can imagine that it's hard, but that you're changing and helping other people. So I'll say that too. Very, very, very grateful for your words. Here's a question, maybe back to Dr. Morrow. What does life look after treatment? I think we already addressed this. What are further treatments needed? Are medications still necessary? That's a great question, right? So if it's major depression, because we do this all the time for other treatments, right? We have other interventions like TMS or ECT. So would someone be able to go off of all of their antidepressants if they got psychedelic treatment?
We don't know, but my experience is that several people have gone off of all of their medications and they're doing just fine. Now, do we know that that's going to be true for everybody? No, we don't know. This is, again, a great research question. There's just a lot that we need to learn still.
Yeah. I have a really great question for you, Dr. Maurer. So some of the resultant symptoms described in using psychedelics seem to echo the Eastern descriptions of enlightenment.
Yeah.
Are these substances a shorthand way of achieving that state? Or what are the differences between the practices of seeking enlightenment and the altered sense of self in this treatment?
Wow, what a question.
You'd like that question.
I love the question, first of all. Yes, there are people using psychedelics for spiritual growth, very specifically just for spiritual growth. And they may not even have any kind of, mental health problem, but they're using it to reach enlightenment. Many people have said that they experienced an enlightened state of being, which, yay, beautiful. Everything's connected. You understand that you are part of the oneness. I mean, it's a beautiful experience. And will everybody experience that? No, of course not. And will it last? We don't know. Will it give you a picture of what you're going toward? Yes, it certainly will. And it may last. It may last. I actually know of somebody who says that they got enlightened using psychedelic medicine. Now, I also know people who were, wanted it so badly, wanted to get to that higher state of consciousness and experienced it while they were tripping. And then it went back to kind of I'm not going to say they went back to square one, because they didn't. They definitely had a more integrated sense of who they were and how they are in the world. And they had a sense of higher consciousness as they moved through their life and their relationships. That's terrific. But they weren't enlightened, and they knew it.
Yeah.
I think
Dr.
the other
Nopoulos,
thing-
can I comment one thing on
You
that?
bet.
Please do.
I would say, in addition to that, I think it's in my experiences, right? It was always very important to get very clear on what my intention was. Okay. Not once did I go into, what I call a ceremony or a session with not being very clear on the intention. I really felt like when I went into the trip, I had to go back out the same door I came in. And it was, like I think Dr. Maurer said earlier, I never necessarily had a bad trip. I had some trips that I absolutely hated while I was in it, but I knew and surrendering and just kind of being in that process, the medicine is not going to lie. I mean, going in and me thinking that, oh, I'm going to go and get this out of it. And I never did any of that, because I knew I was going to be humiliated, with my addiction. So I think the intention is very, very key as well when doing therapy with this.
Yeah, I think Dr. Flom also mentioned too is this disappointment. So the one thing that I worry a little bit about is this concern of, what if I didn't reach enlightenment, right? And so, because it's really important to know is that we don't know. It's not necessarily the content of what you experience, right? That's what, like we said, you can have a challenging experience and it's still effective. So it may not be the content of what you experience, but the intensity of what you experience. And so, like I said, I worry a little bit about people who will get disappointed. Oh, I wasn't enlightened, or, I didn't achieve ego death. That doesn't mean you're not going to benefit from it. And so I think it's all very individual, but it's still very intense. I think we can probably start thinking about wrapping up, but I have a really great question for Dr. Flom, which is, what are the hurdles that come with researching a treatment that has a public stigma and a legislative stigma?
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons that I'm personally so grateful to people like Aaron, and specifically to Aaron. I think the stigma question is very real. I think that what we're trying to do at the University of Iowa, just like our colleagues at other universities, is put out a clear message that we are taking very more than reasonable. We're taking extreme precautions on trying to do this right. We lost over 50 years of an opportunity when these medicines became illegal in around 1970. And these are a window, not only to potentially helping people, and we are in the midst of this crisis of overdose for opioid deaths. We are in the midst of a crisis of suicides.
Yep.
So there's an urgency to bring these treatments out as quickly as possible. But the only way we're going to do that is responsibly. Yep. So I think we just have to do more of what we're doing today, which is educating people that on what the myths are and what the realities are, and hopefully rolling this out, phase 2 of the rollout. Phase 1 began in the late 40s and ended in 1970. We're very much into this next phase of a rollout, doing it responsibly. I think if we do that, and then we have a chance of really making a dramatic difference in the armamentarium of what psychiatrists have to offer.
Yeah. And I want to add to that. We need to realize that we were all captured by the propaganda, and I'm going to call it propaganda, around the war on drugs. I mean, I saw the fried egg in the skillet, and I went, oh my God, that's my brain. You know, it was scary, but it wasn't true. I mean, the picture of the brain that you showed us, Peg, is so beautiful. All these gorgeous new connections being made. That is what's really happening in the brain. And we need to get that information out.
Yep, the hope.
Yep.
So here's a question. I think I'll try, and anyone can jump in as well. So the research on mushrooms is promising. I'm wondering if there's also studies of daily, nearly imperceptible microdosing as a replacement for SSRIs. So it's a great question. There's a lot of questions out there. It is unknown. What I can tell you is that what the research seems to show at this point, that it's not a microdose, that it's actually the intensity. So what we know so far, there are measures of intensity of the experience. And there's a relationship, whatever you call that, intensity, right? So mystical experience, the intensity of that trip is correlated with outcomes, meaning that the more intense the trip, the higher you get on these scales of what we call, mystical experiences, the better the outcome. The better the treatment for depression, the better the treatment for addiction. So there's this relationship. So that suggests that it really needs to be an intense experience. That's what provides the benefit. And whether or not, so because the other question is, maybe it is all drug. Maybe it has nothing to do with the therapy, nothing to do with the experience, and it's just this drug. And you can take it every day like you take an antidepressant, and that helps. There's not a lot of evidence at all to support that yet. It's still an open question. It appears as if the microdosing does not give you the sustained benefit that the trips do.
What we do know from the original, from clinical studies, is that small doses of psilocybin are no different than placebo, at least when given once.
Right, but that's given once. The problem is the research is very weird. I mean, how are you going to assure that somebody's taking a microdose every single day? You can't assure that. And there have been there are a couple of studies out there where the question is asked, are you microdosing? And people write in and say, yes, and I feel better. Well, that isn't science. And we don't know enough about who is taking it and what doses they are taking in order to feel better like that.
I think we should probably wrap it up with one more question. I know that Tony mentioned we could wrap it up whenever we want to, and there's really great questions here, and we really appreciate that. So is this a correct understanding? The treatment allows for a neural pathways to be changed with extreme rapidity, and the attending therapist ensures said changes are appropriate and helpful. Actually, both of you can comment on that, Candida and Michael.
Yeah, wow. That's a good question. Yes, I want to answer yes, that part of the therapy is certainly assuring that what has happened is appropriate. Here's the thing. I've never had anybody say, oh, that's something that I'm thinking, well, that's not appropriate. I mean, that has literally never happened in my experience, and I haven't heard of that happening. So I don't know about that.
What you mean and I'm just trying to understand what that question meaning that you come up with a new new thought or behavior that's not an appropriate one, right? So it doesn't.
It's weird because I have read about people who have gone into a place where they believe that somehow they're super powerful now, and they've got the ability to change the world and blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I haven't personally seen that. If that happened, I would really try to talk somebody out of that. Right. So, because that's a psychotic kind of vision of reality. Yeah.
Michael, do you have any comments on that?
When the person, I think, asked about are changes in the neural pathways, the model is actually a transient change. We'll figure out with brain imaging, hopefully, how long that's sustained. But the way I think about it is Suppose you saw the world with one way, and then somehow there was a different lens, and you realized there were all these things that you were never had been able to see before. Even after that lens is taken away, that may very well change the way you approach the world. So it's not clear that that change in neural pathways is going to be sustained, but the experience of having that view may have these sustained changes.
Mm-hmm. Well, we know that that's true, right? There's all this research on openness. And what we know is that psilocybin creates a trait that theoretically is not changeable, right? Which openness was not a changeable trait, changes. People become more open. Now, we don't really know what that means for sure, but they certainly are more open to new experience, new thoughts, new behaviors. And that seems to last a very long time and may last forever. And I have to say, in my own personal experience, it lasted for 50 years so far.
Right. I think the other thing that's really important, it kind of harkens back to the question about, if this is, serious mental illness or serious addiction, is that it's probably too cavalier to think that just a one trip, that it's often something that sets a path for instance, maybe now after the trip, maybe now you go to rehab, because maybe now rehab is you have a different brain now, right? It's that transient effect. Now rehab is going to be so much more effective for you than it would have been before. And so I think it's really important to think about those things. This is not just even though we talk about sustained effects, it's not just a one and done. And Aaron, you've talked about that as well, is that, you continue to, you have these reflexes, right? You continue to work on that process where you're getting back to, the new lens and how you see yourself in going forward. So I think at that point that like I said, we were really grateful for the questions. There's more questions. We could probably go on for another hour, but I do want to be respectful of people's times. And once again, thank you for everyone who's attending. Thank you so much to those of you who have already given in terms of our program. We're really interested in, I'd mentioned multiple times, growing. We'd really love to do so much more. And so philanthropy is really the foundation of that. And thank you so much to Tony and to Morgan Shea at the Center of Advancement for their support in setting up this really unique event, chat at the Old Cap. So have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.